Hello, everyone. In whatever time or place you're watching this, I hope this finds you abounding in the grace of God and abiding in His love. Since you can't see me, I'm just going to say hello here. Yeah, that's me. That's actually me. And I was going to let you know here in the Houston area, it's October 21st. October 21st. 2020, and it is unseasonably icky. It is really, really toasty here, unseasonably warm. Blech. I don't know if that's how you spell blech. Actually, it's probably like this, right? Blech. Well, anyway, it is unseasonably warm. And I hope, therefore, if it's that way where you are, that you have a nice, delicious, carbonated, artificially sweetened, chemically laced beverage at hand. And that should make the class a little more enjoyable for you. And then I hope you're watching on double speed as well, or at least you're adjusting the speed to get through the class more quickly. And I've explained many times how to do that. If you're joining us for the first time, I hope you know how to do that so that you can speed through the class. And it helps, as I said, it helps the Tyler go down to get through it a little more quickly. I know I talk a little bit slowly and I lag a little bit here and there. So, and speaking of lagging and not getting into the material, let's jump in. All right, so you recall we've been looking at these literary features of Mark's gospel. And we've pointed out his poor Greek and his vivid storytelling. But something we want to keep in mind, and we've been saying this already, but let me remind you that Mark's simple tone, his simpler Greek, and his seemingly vulgar diction and all those things we pointed out, those things belie a really effective rhetoric. And one of the several rhetorical devices he uses to great effect is intercalation. Yes, intercalation. I used to say intercalation, but I think it's like this. Intercalation right there with the accent right there. And this is also referred to as the sandwiching technique. You remember I said we were going to look at Markan sandwiches. That was a while back. I told you, well, we're finally getting into those sandwiches. And if you're not familiar with them, let me explain what they are. Intercalation is called sandwiching because, first of all, look at that. Look at this masterpiece, this mouth-watering masterpiece. Look at that bacon. Looks like it was cooked to perfection. Bacon needs to be crispy or it's pointless, right? And so you've got apple on here as well. And wow. Man, okay. Focus, Tyler, here. So the reason it's referred to as sandwiching is because it's a rhetorical technique where you start a story and then before you get to the end of the story, you interrupt it with a second account. And so you've got story one, like the bread, and on the top and the bottom, and then you're taking some other account and sandwiching it into the middle. That's kind of like I am. I get distracted a lot of times when I'm telling stories, and I'll jump to some backstory to fill in some things. And Kim, the wife, is always telling me it takes me forever to tell a story. Well, and maybe you've done that before, or maybe you've heard people do it. So Mark does it to, as I said, to great effect in his gospel. Let's look at some interesting examples of this and what it might indicate what we should be noticing from it. Remember, we want to see how the use of rhetoric, the way the text is written, the way Mark is arranging his material, we want to see how that is emphasizing what Mark wants us, what the Holy Spirit is trying to highlight for us, that the Lord wants us to pay attention to because of the way these accounts are constructed. So here you can see the start of the first story and the end of the first story, but then we're going to have sandwiched in between the happy part of the sandwich, in between the bread, the second story. So chapter 3, look at this. Jesus' family sets out to seize him. And instead of just finishing the story, which he will get back to what happens when they finally find him, he inserts into the middle of that how Jesus was accused of casting out demons by the power of Satan. So the Jewish leaders are accusing him of operating by demonic power. And so perhaps the emphasis here is that Jesus' own family failing to understand who he is, and in a way rejecting him at this point. I mean, the text begins by saying they went out to seize him, for they were saying he's out of his mind. So they think he's crazy. The Jewish leaders think he's operating by the power of the devil. Jesus uses the occasion to highlight that those who really belong to him, he finishes by saying, well, here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and sister and mother, verse 35. And so it seems to emphasize, arranged this way, it seems to emphasize that Jesus' own family and their misunderstanding and their rejection of him foreshadows the rejection of Jesus by his people in general. Now, in chapter 5, you have probably the most familiar intercalation in Mark's gospel, where the story is interrupted. You remember where Jesus leaves to heal Jairus' daughter. At that point, she's ill. When Jesus finally arrives, she has died and Jesus raises her from the dead. But what happens on the way, Mark tells us about the woman with the issue of blood, the woman with the problem with hemorrhaging, how she's healed by touching Jesus' garment. And we see how her faith is commended by Christ, and the accounts sandwiched this way seem to emphasize then the importance of faith. Because notice, he commends the woman in chapter 5:34, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." And then when he arrives and Jairus' daughter is dead, he says, "Do not fear, only believe," verse 36. And so we can see a beautiful emphasis on the importance of faith in the way these accounts are arranged. And then look at this example in chapter 6. Jesus sends out the disciples to preach. That begins in chapter 6 and verse 7. And then in verse 30, we get an account, or at least a reference to them returning and giving an account to Jesus. In between, instead of telling us the story separately, he could have added that concluding remark after Jesus told them to go out. But in between, we have Mark's lengthy account with considerable detail of the martyrdom of John, how Herod murdered John because you remember of the request of Herodias. And so this seems to suggest, now John's the Lord's faithful prophet, and he is killed by an enemy of God. And so This seems to suggest that, or it's sort of foreshadowing again the idea that when God, the Lord, sends us out to preach, and when we faithfully follow Christ in making known His will, that we will suffer persecution and perhaps even death. And one more, and this is interesting how the account is so different in Mark than the way we find it in Matthew. But Jesus curses the fig tree for not bearing fruit. And then when they pass by again, we find the fig tree that Jesus cursed has withered and died. What happens in between? Jesus cleanses the temple. He calls it a den of robbers. And I notice I need my little exclamation points here on the end, or rather quotation marks. I need to correct that. I can do it right here on the fly. Yes, right there. That makes me happy. Now we've got it all fixed. So this suggests again that the cursing of the fig tree representing how Israel had failed to be faithful to God and bear fruit as His people. And so in between, Jesus goes out and cleanses the temple which the Jewish leaders had corrupted, showing once again how they, even though they were there in the temple, they were not being faithful to God and bearing the fruit that He expected, but were in fact perverting the way of God. And so the cursing of the fig tree brackets that, and together creates a greater emphasis on Israel's rejection of Christ and the condemnation of God upon them because of it. And just a little bit of added interest here. I said it's different than what you find in Matthew's account. In Matthew's account, when Jesus curses the fig tree in Matthew 21, 18 and 19, Matthew says it withered immediately. But in Mark's account, he's separating that. The disciples don't notice it until they were passing by again the next morning. It says that they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. And then Peter remembered and said to them, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed is withered," as though they hadn't noticed it earlier. And so, again, he's taking the same account in the life of Jesus, but he is telling it, he's crafting it in a different way to highlight what he wants to highlight, what God wants him to highlight for us in his own way. So that's why I think this adds a lot of interest when you realize what Mark is doing in the way he's giving us these accounts. And so we continue. We've got intercalation then, or the sandwiching technique. And then we can point out as well, Mark likes to use triads. And here, let me give you some examples once again to see how he'll put things in groups of three. Not to mean that they're all together, 1, 2, 3, listed together, but that there are three kinds of the same thing included in his gospel. For example, there are 3 boat scenes. And again, let's think about what including 3 different scenes like that is, what the point of that is. Well, that highlights the disciples' lack of faith each time, and their lack of comprehension. Well, Mark is really driving home the point, including in his account several, in fact, those 3 scenes. There are in his account, as you know, 3 passion predictions, and each time there is some reaction on the part of the disciples. There's some action, rather, on the part of the disciples where they display a selfishness and a cluelessness that Jesus then addresses by speaking of the importance of humility and suffering, of true servant leadership. And so that provides a contrast. The pride of the disciples is contrasted with the humility and suffering of Jesus. And obviously, we're supposed to be getting the point here that the disciples' attitude is sinful, and we need to try to avoid that and imitate our Savior as we follow Him, that we're willing to suffer, that we're willing to humble ourselves rather than advance ourselves. We're willing to humble ourselves and do whatever we need to do in order to be faithful to Christ. So by including that 3 times, again, it really brings home the point. There are 3 calls to watchfulness, and this is in the little apocalypse, as it's called there in John chapter 13. We haven't mentioned that yet, really, or looked at it, but in Jesus' prediction of the destruction of Jerusalem, which I think is meant to be a type of the final coming and the parousia, and so it has an eschatological emphasis, we would say. But 3 times in there is a call to be watchful. And so that would seem to stress, I've got the wrong point here, let me fix this. That would seem to stress the need for vigilance in light of coming trial and in light of the final coming of Christ, in fact. And so the need for vigilance. Then we have the disciples asleep in the garden, and Jesus comes to them 3 times. So once more we find them weak in a time of trial. And you remember we said early on that it may be the case Mark is writing to a community of Christians who do not properly understand discipleship and are in danger of failing to fully and faithfully follow the Lord. And so these sorts of things seem to be included again and again in his gospel. We have, for example, Peter's denials. Peter famously denied the Lord 3 times. And so there seems to be, you remember Peter protested, Peter insisted he would never deny the Lord. They all said that, but Peter is mentioned specifically as insisting that he would not deny the Lord. And so we need to be aware of the danger of a false sense of security or an overconfidence, of letting our guard down, and failure to confess Christ when our faith is really on the line and we're facing some kind of hardship because of it. So there's a lot to learn there too, isn't there? And then Mark mentions 3 different times, he mentions 3-hour intervals in the crucifixion account. And that perhaps then is meant to really convey to us the length of Jesus' suffering. He's giving us the time element. He's telling us about the passing of time as Jesus is hanging on the cross. You remember we said Mark's gospel, more than the others, puts more emphasis on the passion account and the death and the suffering of Jesus. And so this intensifies the whole drama of his death, those time intervals being mentioned. And now let's add still another literary feature of Mark's gospel, his use of irony. And here again, some examples that I think will be interesting to contemplate, but I wanted to note here, you can't spell irony without, yes, without New York. Of course, you can't spell it without iron, but you can't spell it without New York. That means absolutely nothing, but let's look at our examples. As we do, keep in mind that a key theme in Mark, as we keep pointing out, is the suffering of the Messiah. That to understand Jesus' Messiahship properly, we need to understand that it is his death on the cross that is qualifying him to do what the Lord has appointed for the Messiah to do. So that itself is paradoxical. The idea of God's anointed one, his chosen one, being rejected and suffering. So Mark's gospel, in a way, is shaped altogether around an ironic an ironic truth. And there are lots of examples. Consider some situational irony in Mark's gospel. And you're familiar with these accounts, no doubt, where Jesus is accused, as we already pointed out, he's accused by the Jewish leaders of being in league with Satan when, of course, they are actually the ones who are in rebellion to the will of God and therefore are really doing the work of the devil because they're going to ultimately then reject Christ and crucify him. And of course, God is going to use that for his purpose. But what an irony for them to accuse Jesus of being in league with Satan. And then it's ironic when they come and flatter Jesus, right? And say, "Oh, teacher, we know that you are true and that you truly teach the way of God." And of course, they don't mean it. But the reader knows that it's actually true, that he really is the one who is teaching the way of God. What an irony. Yes. And then, of course, when he's on the cross and they're mocking him, he saved others, but he cannot save himself, or he saved others. Let him save himself. But we know that it was in dying on the cross, in yielding himself, in not saving himself, that he was saving others, that he was providing for our salvation. They called him Christ, the King of Israel, but of course, in a mocking way, when we know actually that is exactly who Jesus is. So much irony surrounding the crucifixion scene, profound ironies, the most profound ironies, I think, in all of history. For example, look at this. The religious leaders will not see Jesus as, and that should be as, and I could start this slide over, but I can also just fix it while we're talking here. Let's see if it's going to work. You know I have to do this because of my OCD. Let's just fix it on the fly. How about that? Instead of starting the class over. Whoops. It's got to be black. It was red there. They don't see Jesus as the Son of God, but from the start of Mark's gospel, the demons know his true identity. And then, irony of ironies, when he dies, his executioner, the centurion in charge of the detail that crucified him and the others, he recognizes it, or he at least pronounces it, even if he doesn't fully understand it. But it's the Jewish elite that do not know who Jesus really is, and or rather they do not know, but the demons and even his executioner know. We see how those who are in the inside become outsiders, and then the outsiders become those on the inside of the kingdom. That's evident from going through his gospel. And then as well, we see Jesus in his teaching with parables, that the parables seem simple enough and obvious enough on the face of them. Let me move this text over here where we can see it a little bit better. And yet, they're not understood by the experts in the law, by those who thought they had such great understanding of the will of God. They're not understood. And so that simple teaching, Jesus said, was to both reveal God's will to those who are really seeking to know it, but conceal it at the same time so that others would not see it. We'll notice that when Jesus explains to the disciples why he's teaching in parables. And I just realized that I think I had it right the first time, that it is, I wanted the word is there, that they won't recognize Jesus is the Son of God. So should have just left it. All right, let's move on. And what about this? While Jesus is on trial before the Sanhedrin, and they insist to know whether he is the Christ. Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? Verse 61. And Jesus affirms that he is. And so as Jesus confesses he is the Messiah, at that very time, Peter is out in the courtyard denying him. And so that is yet another irony, a tragic irony in Mark's gospel, as is, of course, Jesus' rejection and crucifixion itself. And to these we can add what we'll call verbal ironies in Mark's gospel, where you have some pronouncements made, and some of the ones we already mentioned were situational and had some kind of verbal, some kind of affirmation or statement as well that was ironic. But here I mean things like where you see Jesus' use of the proverb in chapter 6 when he's in his hometown. Only in a hometown is a prophet, and his hometown is a prophet without honor. It might be considered ironic that Jesus nicknames Peter a term that means the rock, even though we see in the gospel that Peter is not very stable and rock-like. Jesus sees something in him and gives him the name Peter, which means rock. And so it's ironic then what we see later in the gospel about Peter. But of course, what we find ultimately in the life of the church, that Peter was indeed the rock that Jesus could see. Jesus could foresee what God would do with him. But it's ironic when we look at it in Mark's account, I think. And then what about, I love this one, where Jesus is sarcastically commending the Jewish leaders when he says, oh, you've got a fine way of rejecting the commandments of God. You know, look at that. That's like saying, yeah, you guys are really good at rejecting God's commandments so that you can keep your tradition. I mean, the Lord is using that biting sarcasm there. And so that sarcasm is a form of irony, really. And he's exposing the irony that they are the ones who thought they were the keepers of the law and who safeguarded the faithful keeping of the law and all of that, and yet they had really done a great job. You've done a great job of learning how to reject God's commandments so you can keep your tradition. What a powerful rebuke in the way that Mark records it, I think, especially. Now, I really should have added this one. This should have been included, I think, when we were looking at content and structure of Mark's Gospel, and I realize I did not, and I do want to at least mention it here. And so I think, in a way, it could be considered a literary feature of his Gospel. So I've got it in parentheses here because really I wish I had had it back on the class where we were going through how Mark's Gospel is structured. But we should note there is a focus on Galilee that makes his gospel unique. You know, the first half of the gospel tells about Jesus' ministry in Galilee. There's very little reference to Jesus' activity elsewhere. But when you get to chapter 10, there's an abrupt shift to Judea, and then Jesus ultimately travels to Jerusalem, where he's rejected and put on trial and crucified. But even then, Jesus promises, you remember, to meet his followers after his resurrection. He promises to meet them in Galilee. And that's critical when we realize that or it's all the more distinctive, I should say, when we realize that in the other Gospels, Jesus, after his resurrection, appears to his followers in Jerusalem. We learn from Matthew, Luke, and John, and in Judea we find in Luke chapter 24. And so we see how Galilee becomes a unique focus of John's Gospel, or of Mark's Gospel rather, I should say, and wanted to be sure we understood that when we go to the Gospel of Mark. And you can think about how geography and theology are sometimes related. we don't have time to explore that further, but we did notice that, for example, with Luke's gospel and his emphasis on Jerusalem, how it becomes a big part, his emphasis on Jerusalem becomes a big part of how he tells us the story. Well, perhaps in a similar way, Mark wants to focus on the works that Jesus did in Galilee. So at last we come to themes and theology in Mark's gospel. And this will be our last point before we conclude with the Christology of Mark's gospel. And so this is our penultimate point. And really the Christology can be considered as a subheading under the heading of theology. But here, let's think about, we're going to hold off on the Christology to conclude with that. Let's think of other theologies. Let's look at some other themes that we find in Mark's gospel here. And I'm just going to introduce this for right now and look at this first point, just set it out before you, and we'll develop it more next time. And this is one that is fascinating to consider, and it's one often remarked upon. It's the motif of mystery that we find in Mark's gospel, the motif of mystery. And there's a lot to this. It's a complicated point, and it really takes some time to think about it properly. All I want to do right now, though, is give you some examples of what I mean here, or what we're talking about when we talk about the secrecy or mystery motif in Mark's gospel. The motif of mystery is not limited to this, but it is what is, I think, primarily emphasized from Mark's gospel, and it's something called the messianic secret. I'll mention next time why it's referred to in that way. But the messianic secret, all right, have you ever wondered when you're reading Mark's gospel, and this is mentioned in Matthew and Luke, but it does not seem to be an interest to them. They're only including it when they're, I believe, relying on Mark as a source. So Mark is really the one that is bringing this out, and there are references in his gospel that are unique to his gospel along this line. So there's more to it than this, but the times when Jesus is sort of hushing people and trying to get people to keep his identity a secret. Doesn't he want his identity to be known? In fact, when he heals the demoniac, he tells them to go into the village and tell everyone what great things God has done for him. Yet elsewhere, again and again and again, we find Jesus telling people to keep quiet who he is. Let me just look at some examples, and as I said, we'll explore this next time. All right, here we are in chapter 1, right from the start, when Jesus heals a man or cleanses a man who has an unclean spirit here. So there's a man with an unclean spirit. And what does the demonic spirit cry out? What does he say? What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are. Wow. So striking that right at the beginning of Mark's gospel, we have some mysterious demonic force identified as an unclean spirit saying, I know who you are. You're the Holy One of God. But Jesus rebukes him and wants him to keep silent. Be silent, he says, and come out of him. And so this causes, of course, great wonder and amazement. The spirit convulsed him, cried with a loud voice, came out of him. Look at the detail Mark gives us and how dramatic this was, and everyone was amazed. But notice there's a hint of it already at the beginning of Mark's gospel. Be silent. Well, be silent. What's he saying? Well, you're the Holy One of God. Then notice further in chapter 1 when we're told that Jesus healed the leper and made him clean. What does he say to the leper? See that you say nothing to anyone. Say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer what Moses commanded as a proof. And then notice it seems rather pointless for Jesus to do this, because then the text says he went out and began to talk freely about it. It was more than he could bear to keep it to himself, and we're told he spread the news. And this may give us a clue as to at least part of the reason why Jesus was trying to hush people about his identity, because then Jesus could no longer openly enter a town. And so he was out in desolate places. People were coming to him. But notice that the Lord tells him, see that you say nothing to anyone. It's stated very emphatically there. All right, in chapter 3 now, we read here of how it's a general account where he had healed many. Verse 10, so that all who had diseases had pressed around just to touch him. And whenever unclean spirits saw him, they fell down before him and cried, "You are the Son of God." But what would Jesus do? He strictly ordered them not to make him known. And of course, those demonic powers were subject to the power and the authority of Jesus Christ as the Son of God. He strictly ordered them not to make him known. And then in chapter 5, when Jesus raised Jairus' daughter from the dead, what happened there? In verse 43, he strictly charged them that no one should know this. And then it said, give her something to eat. But that no one should know this. Then we find in chapter 7, with this unusual miracle where Jesus spit and touched his tongue and sighed and cried out, Ephphatha, and be opened. And his ears were opened and his tongue was released and he spoke plainly. But notice this, verse 36 again. Jesus charged them, tell no one. And here again, why would Jesus even bother to tell them if he knows this is going to happen? That the more he charged, the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. So Mark here's still another irony. We could include this in our list of ironies. The more Jesus tries to get them to be quiet about it, the more it becomes known. And then we have, of course, the very famous account of Jesus, and this is a climax in Mark's Gospel, a key text, when Jesus is in Caesarea Philippi with the disciples, and he asked them, who do you say that I am? Finally, he asked them in verse 29, Peter said to him, you are the Christ. And then once more, what do we find? He strictly charged them to tell no one about him, at least not at that time, because we know ultimately he's training them to go tell the whole world about him. So we'll think about that when we proceed to look at this further next time. And then after Jesus took Peter, James, and John up to the Mount of Transfiguration where they saw him in glory with Moses and Elijah, when they're coming down the mountain, chapter 9 and verse 9, he charged them to tell no one what they had seen. But now here's another clue, of course. We'll come back to this. Until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. But charged them to tell no one what they had seen. This is a part of what we call the Messianic secret. And we'll think about why in the world Jesus would do that and what effect that has in Mark's Gospel as he is in fact developing his Christology. We'll see how it ties in with a greater point that Mark wants to emphasize about understanding what it means to follow Jesus. To do that, you have to know who he really is. And so, again, I'm getting ahead of myself, but here we are at 40 minutes and I'm finishing the class. So this is kind of miraculous in itself, isn't it? 40-minute class. If you watched it on double speed, it was just 20 minutes long, and surely you had your refreshing beverage at hand and maybe a couple yummy snacks. My favorite, peanut M&Ms, yum. But whatever the case might be, I pray God's blessings will be upon you until we meet again. May His peace be with you. God bless you, and I look forward, Lord willing, to studying with you next time.